Hey there, Donovan. I appreciate you giving me a chance to get this story out of my head, especially since I haven't really discussed any of this in any detail for more than 3 decades. I have all these memories swirling around, and at my age, with my health in the state it is, I figure I have nothing left to lose by sharing it. I used to think I might write it down in a journal or something, but that always felt too risky even after all these years. But I am ready now to just speak freely, without bullet points or that official language we had beaten into us in the service. If it ends up on your YouTube channel, or if it just remains in your inbox, I don't much care. And it all happened when I was assigned to Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, from around the late 1980s into the early 1990s. For those folks who don't know, Dugway is a U.S. Army facility located in Utah, primarily focused on the testing and evaluation of chemical and biological defense systems and equipment. Anyway, I never expected to end up stationed there, let alone wrapped up in what we used to call the hollow compound. I enlisted in the Army in the mid-1970s, did my time in Germany for a while, spent some stateside tours, typical stuff. By the time I got to Dugway, I was already in my early 30s, which made me older than quite a few of the younger guys in our unit. I guess that is partly why I was chosen for this particular detail, because I was calm, not prone to complaining or asking too many questions, and I was considered a reliable MP who followed the chain of command. When I arrived, my understanding was that I would be joining a specialized security unit, operating in pretty remote desert territory out there west of Salt Lake City, tasked with typical guard duties and perimeter patrol for some of the advanced weapons testing areas. But it did not take long to realize there was much more going on. Dugway has always had a reputation for advanced research and testing of all kinds of chemical and biological weapons. Most folks don't realize how massive and desolate that land is out there. Entire grids of desert that used to be farmland or grazing land, all fenced off and dotted with observation towers. There are bunkers, labs, random mock urban setups for training exercises, you name it. If you look at map references or read old Army brochures, you might think it is all standard testing. But the moment you start meeting the people who live and work there full time, there is this hush that falls over certain conversations. People do not just talk about everything they see. You learn not to ask too many questions about trucks that rumble in and out at odd hours. Within my first 2 months, I noticed a pattern of night arrivals. These massive unmarked semi-trailers with armed escorts. Sometimes the escort vehicles were just plain black SUVs with tinted windows, sometimes MP Jeeps. The reason it struck me as odd is we, as part of the typical security detail, were often told not to approach these convoys. We got direct instructions over the radio from command, telling us to remain at a certain checkpoint and let them pass without inspection. That may not sound too dramatic, but for an MP guard used to checking and documenting every vehicle that comes and goes, it is unusual. That was my first clue that there was a deeper layer to all of this. Eventually, I got tapped for guard duty in a very specific subterranean sector. We just called it the hollow compound. No official sign said that. There was simply a heavily secured cargo elevator that descended below one of the older bunkers on post. Getting down there required multiple coded keycards, plus a companion guard who had the second half of the code. And then, once inside, you were not supposed to speak of it, even to other members of the security forces, unless they were on an identical assignment. Whenever I was on that duty, it was always me and one other fellow. We would be stationed near the elevator doors in a small booth, about the size of one of those toll booths you sometimes see, but it was built into the concrete corridor. Sometimes we would sit for hours in silence, just occasionally checking the cameras. Other times, we had higher-ups come down, sometimes with scientific-looking staff or men in suits who never showed us any ID. We were told by our direct CO that all those visitors were cleared through chain of command, so do not hold them up. Do not bother them with questions. Just do as they say. I cannot tell you how many times I saw sweaty, pale-faced men in lab coats scuttling in and out of that elevator, often pushing large steel carts with who knows what strapped down under tarps. The name the hollow compound came from the echoing effect in those corridors. Sound did not behave normally down there. You could often hear whispered voices bouncing off the walls, but sometimes you could not tell if they were just your imagination, because the architecture funneled the slightest noises from what must have been deeper tunnels below. The deeper you went, the more you felt this sense of pressure in your ears, like going up in an airplane. It was easy to get spooked. The official or semi-official name never appeared on any documents I saw. We only knew it was referred to that way by a handful of us who had the same guard rotation. One guy, who was older than me by maybe 10 years, once mentioned that the place had been there since at least the 1950s, maybe earlier, and that it was originally a nuclear or chemical storage site. Maybe that was the original purpose, but I doubt that was all that was going on. In that first year, the weirdness mostly involved the convoys at night. These trucks would arrive sealed up tight, sometimes padlocked multiple times. Some nights you would hear the strangest sounds coming from inside as they drove by. Not mechanical sounds, not anything that sounded like standard equipment, more like deep rumbles or occasional shrieks that would rise and fall, almost like an animal in pain, and then it would just go silent. A lot of times, these convoys would go straight to the cargo elevator, unload those crates or containers, and vanish back into the desert night. We did not talk about it among ourselves, or if we did, it would be dismissive talk in the wreck area, saying that it must be some sort of advanced weapons testing. But you could see it in the other guy's eyes that nobody really believed the official line. When you see a crate that appears to move on its own, or you hear what sounds like metal scraping from inside, even though it is sealed, that leaves you questioning what you really saw. There was one night, maybe around fall of 1988. I remember it was chilly, but not freezing. We had been put on a higher alert status, though nobody outside of command knew why. That night, 2 semis arrived escorted by no fewer than 8 heavily armed men. They were not in standard army fatigues. They had black uniforms and gear that did not match ours. They had a completely different type of rifle than what we used, and they never spoke a word to us. The ranking officer on duty told us that these men were part of a specialized security contractor working in conjunction with the government. We were to treat them with respect and not impede their progress into the hollow compound. One guard next to me later said that some of them had a small patch on their shoulders that looked like an owl or some bird silhouette, but I never got close enough to see for myself. The trucks disappeared down the cargo elevator, and we heard bizarre noises echoing up even though they were several levels below. It was like a muffled mix of mechanical pounding and some sort of wailing. Hard to describe. Everything in my gut told me we were not dealing with standard equipment at all. As time went on, I saw a pattern of new guards rotating into the job, but they never stayed long. Some of the guys I started with just vanished. Initially, I assumed they got reassigned to some other location, or they left the service. But the more you keep watch, the more you realize it is not normal for so many people to just fade away without any mention. Some of us who had been there a year or more joked that there was a black hole under Dugway that swallowed people who asked too many questions. At the time, I chalked it up to paranoia. But a few times, I asked around about certain guys I used to see in the mess hall, only to be told that they had been discharged for administrative reasons, or moved to a new duty station in Germany, or Fort Hood or someplace. Yet I never saw them pack up or get a farewell. Everything was hush-hush. One evening in early 1989, I was off duty and hanging out at a small bar in Toul with a friend who was also an MP. He told me that earlier that week, he had been assigned to an outside perimeter patrol near one of the restricted test grids. He swore he saw bright lights in the sky at around 0230, just hovering. He said it was not flares or any kind of aircraft he recognized. He also told me that he got on the radio to report it, but was swiftly told to stand down and that it was a classified operation. It made me think about the occasional rumors of UFO sightings around Dugway. The place has a lot of strange aircraft tests, so part of me always figured the UFO rumors were some leftover Cold War nonsense. But my buddy was dead serious, and it seemed to really shake him. That conversation never left my head, because it was just another piece of the puzzle, another dimension to the secrecy of that installation. You had the subterranean compound with weird cargo, rumored UFO sightings overhead, and top brass telling us to keep quiet about everything. It is possible that some of what was going on down there was related to biological weapons, or exotic animals being tested or genetically modified, but that does not explain all the phenomena we witnessed. Late one shift, about 6 months into my assignment at the Hollow compound, I was in the monitor room just adjacent to the guard booth by the elevator. The camera showed a corridor some 2 or 3 levels down. We normally did not have direct guard presence down that far, but we had cameras to keep an eye on the elevator exits. I recall seeing movement in the hallway, a tall figure walking on 2 legs, but it was not any person I recognized, nor was it wearing a uniform. The lighting was dim and the camera quality was not great, so I could not make out clear facial details, but it had an odd shape to its head, almost elongated, and the arms seemed unnaturally long. It moved quickly out of frame, and I just sat there stunned. I asked the other guard if he had seen that, and he just shook his head and told me to keep my mouth shut. He said we see weird things on the monitors from time to time, and it is best not to get curious. Not long after that, I started noticing the commanding officers were behaving erratically. Some days they would be easygoing, handing out compliments like they wanted to keep morale up. Other days they would be furious and suspicious of every little infraction, threatening us with court-martial if we leaked any info about our duties. It was like they were struggling to maintain control over something that was bigger than them. Once I tried to ask a lieutenant for clarifications about some unusual protocol regarding the cargo elevator. He gave me this stone-cold stare and said that if I treasured my Army career and possibly my freedom, I would not poke around where I was not needed. I got the message loud and clear. Things got even more bizarre in the summer of 1989. We had a spate of nighttime incidents where the security alarms in the Hollow compound would go off randomly. Sirens in that subterranean sector were deafening, and we would scramble to our stations, thinking it was a breach or some sabotage attempt. But then we would be ordered to stand down, and a higher-up in a full protective suit would appear. These suits looked like a cross between standard hazmat gear and something far more advanced. The faceplate was tinted black, so you could barely see who was inside. They would calmly walk deeper into the corridor, and then the alarms would suddenly stop. We would never get any explanation other than it was a containment drill, but you could sense the tension. People's eyes would dart around, as if everyone was trying to figure out what the real mission was down there. Maybe it was all about containing an airborne pathogen, or maybe it was something else entirely. Between 1989 and 1990, there were rumors floating among some of the older guards about reptilian entities. I never saw anything that I could definitively say was a reptilian being, but I did see glimpses of something on the cameras that looked vaguely like an upright lizard shape. Could have been a trick of the shadows or an artifact of the poor lighting, but I remember the feeling it gave me. I asked one of my buddies if he had heard about reptilian sightings, and he told me that ever since the 1960s, there had been talk of not just aliens or advanced weapons at Dugway, but actual living creatures that were part of some top-secret project. Some guys believed we had captured something from somewhere else and were housing it in these underground labs. Others thought we were engineering something so advanced it was basically a new species of creature. Nobody knew for sure, but a hush about reptilians was definitely present in the rumor mill. One of the strangest moments came in late 1990 or early 1991, around the time the Gulf War was kicking off. A group of us, maybe 5 or 6 guys, were pulled into a briefing by a colonel we had never seen before. This colonel was older, had this authoritative presence, and told us that we were being commended for our discretion and loyalty to the mission. Then he hinted that the mission might go deeper than conventional defense, implying national security measures that extend beyond typical warfighting. He never outright said anything about creatures or experiments, but he used phrases like alternative threats and clandestine research necessary for the protection of our nation. After that meeting, we each were handed a sealed envelope containing some sort of legal document. I never opened mine in front of anyone. Later, when I did, it was essentially a reaffirmation of the non-disclosure agreements we had signed, along with new language about indefinite classification. It basically reminded us that violating secrecy could result in life imprisonment, or worse. That was probably the moment I realized how high level this was. If they were sending more official hush letters, it meant something big was at stake. Around that same time, I had a jarring encounter that made me question everything I was doing there. I was on duty late at night, near the cargo elevator again, when a small group of men in suits passed through. One of them looked really uneasy, like he was out of his depth. Another was calm and had a chilling confidence about him. They instructed me to stay right where I was, not to leave my post no matter what I heard, not to come check on them. Maybe half an hour later, I heard an argument echoing from down the corridor. I could not make out the exact words, but it sounded like one of them was furious about either a containment breach or the unexpected aggression of something. I heard bangs and that guttural sound again, the same deep rumbling and grunting that was not quite human and not quite any animal I recognized. Then the group came rushing back. The uneasy man in suits looked pale, and his left pant leg was torn, as if by claws or something sharp. Indirectly, I caught bits of the conversation. Phrases like, "We cannot keep doing this, and it is getting more unstable." The calmer man in suits put his hand on the other's shoulder. They marched back to the elevator, and I watched them ascend. Shortly after, I got a direct call from a senior officer telling me not to breathe a word of this to anyone. I spent many a sleepless night thinking about what was going on below. Sometimes you rationalize that it could be advanced robotics, or some kind of genetically modified chimera for warfare, but a part of me suspected it was bigger than any of that. There were nights I heard that unearthly howling that made my skin crawl. It was distant, echoing up from below, but it was definitely not a machine. I repeated to myself that I had to keep it together, keep following orders, keep collecting that paycheck, and keep my pension on track. I had a family, and the army was my life. Rocking the boat was not an option. In the second half of 1991, a few events happened in quick succession that really turned up the fear factor. First, an entire shift of guards was replaced overnight with fresh faces. None of us recognized them, and they spoke very little. They seemed to have no sense of humor or personality. They were more like statues than soldiers, hyper-vigilant. It was as if the army had brought in some specialized paramilitary guys who answered only to the top brass. Then, there were more frequent deliveries by those large semis. Some nights, we had 3 or 4 truckloads in a row, each with an armed escort that looked more intense than usual. We heard rumors that something had changed in the facility, that maybe they were scaling up or transferring something. I saw more men in hazmat suits, more men in suits, more overall tension. I recall one guard mentioning after a shift that he had overheard a conversation about a new occupant in the hollow compound. That occupant was described indirectly as bigger and more aggressive than the others. This guard was absolutely rattled. He said that as he was heading to a break room inside the underground levels, he heard a scraping from behind the wall and the same deep growling noise. When he asked his CO about it, the CO just told him to keep walking and not ask questions. That same guard was gone within a few weeks. No farewell, no trace. We never saw him again. Sometime early in 1992, my own mental health started to suffer. I was having nightmares about being trapped in those corridors with something chasing me, something that was not human. It was tall and hunched, with large reflective eyes. That is just the image my subconscious gave it. I am not sure if it matched anything that was really down there. I knew I had to start planning an exit from the army, but I worried about losing my pension, or possibly having some nasty retributions if I tried to speak out. I confided in one friend who had also been stationed there for a while. He told me that his uncle once tried to blow the whistle on some top-secret operation in the Air Force years ago, and that it ruined his life. The government can come after you for everything. But then in mid-1992, I had a medical issue that put me on limited duty and that effectively ended my direct involvement in the hollow compound. My superiors decided that I could do administrative tasks until I recovered. By the time I was medically cleared, they were rotating me out to another post. It was not a normal reassignment. It happened quietly, but it was definitely orchestrated. I was never asked to set foot in the hollow compound again. I spent my remaining time at Dugway on more mundane details, perimeter checks, ammo depot guard, that kind of thing. Then in early 1993, I left active service. I had enough time in to start my retirement process. Plus, I had lingering health complications that made me want to settle down. They gave me the typical Army retirement file, plus a fresh version of that non-disclosure agreement. My final commanding officer gave me a firm handshake and said that I had served honorably. Then he said something about how loyalty to one's country sometimes means keeping quiet for life. For a couple of years, I hardly breathed a word of my experiences. I had nightmares every so often, but I tried to bury it. Now, all these years later, with my health in decline, my doctors telling me that I do not have too long, I find myself reliving those nights in the hollow compound. I can hear the metal doors screeching open into those dark corridors. I can see those flickering overhead lights in the security camera feed. I can feel that sinking sensation in my gut every time an unmarked truck arrived with unnatural cargo. And more than anything, I hear those horrifying sounds. The growls, the shrieks, sometimes even a sort of chattering that almost sounded like it was forming words in some unknown language. It might help to mention something that seemed suspicious, but that I didn't connect until decades later. The local rumor mill in small Utah towns around Dugway occasionally referenced missing livestock, missing hikers, and sightings of unusual lights at night out by the desert ridges. One time, while driving from Dugway toward Grantsville, I stopped at a small gas station. The old man at the counter recognized me as Army and started telling me about strange booms in the night. He said he had heard them for years. Big booming noises that did not sound like normal ordnance testing. And he said sometimes you could see weird craft in the air, shaped like triangles or rectangles, flying silently overhead. That conversation stuck with me because it reinforced the sense that the entire region around Dugway was host to anomalies that were not purely engineering or weapons tests. And something else that comes to mind is a conversation I overheard while in line at the commissary on base. Two guys in plain clothes, obviously Army but not necessarily part of my unit, were talking about an incident where someone tried to dial 911 from a base phone, apparently in the midst of a panic, but the call was intercepted by base security. All the civilians in the area picked up on was an attempt to get the local sheriff about a dire emergency, but local law enforcement was turned away at the gate. Then the conversation got hushed. I never found out the official story, but if you read between the lines, it probably had something to do with a mistake made by a lab tech or a guard who encountered something they should not have. The entire place was locked down that night, from what I could gather, and the official statement the next day was that it was a drill. There were also stories about some type of large canine creature roaming the outer perimeter. Some guards swore they saw it standing on its hind legs in the distance, but it would vanish behind the dunes or behind a cluster of buildings. Others claimed it was simply a coyote or feral dog. But the older guys, especially the ones who had been around, said that sometimes you would see more than one, and they walked in a way that was almost human-like. One guard told me that he once found unusual tracks near a chain-link fence that was well inside the perimeter. He described them as paw prints, but the spacing and shape seemed off, like the back part of the foot was elongated. He snapped a few Polaroids, but after showing them to a superior, he was told to hand them over, never to be seen again. When he tried to bring it up a few weeks later, he was told to forget about it. That guard eventually requested a transfer and was lucky enough to get it. I crossed paths with him right before he shipped out, and he simply muttered that they keep things out here that we do not want to know about. When I think about the hush-hush environment, Along with all these bizarre sightings, it does not take a big leap to suspect that the hollow compound and the entire subterranean network might have housed a variety of classified research projects, possibly including custody of cryptid-type creatures, or maybe something from beyond our planet, or some mutated test subjects. I never received official confirmation, obviously, but the evidence certainly pointed in that direction, and the deeper you were assigned, the more you saw or heard glimpses of it. That weight of secrecy was suffocating. You knew if you asked too many questions or strayed from your post, you would vanish into the same black hole that claimed so many others. Some of them might have been shipped off to new assignments. Some might have been threatened or bribed into silence. And there is always the unsettling possibility that more drastic measures were taken. I recall a day, I think it was late 1992, when one of the senior scientists, I say scientist because he wore a lab coat, had thick glasses and seemed academic, stopped at our checkpoint and casually asked if anyone on our shift had reported hearing persistent telepathic voices or experiencing intense headaches. We all just stared at him. He was not making a joke. That question alone was enough to spark major anxiety. Why would we be hearing telepathic voices out of the blue? And the way he asked it sounded so clinical, as if it were a typical symptom. I wanted to ask him more, but he hurried off, muttering that he had to gather data. To this day, that is one of the single most disturbing things I ever encountered there, because it implies something well beyond mutated animals or advanced weapons. Telepathic voices are not something you typically hear about in run-of-the-mill Army research facilities. Let me dive into another memory that just popped into my mind. One night, yours truly was stationed in a narrow corridor near a heavy steel door labeled only with a coded number. I stood there for hours, bored and tired, but the tension in that place always kept me on edge. At some point, I heard voices from the other side. Multiple adult voices, but with an echo that almost made them sound distant or in a large open space. One voice was more urgent, and I believe I caught the words, "It is adapting." Then all of a sudden, something banged against the steel door from the inside, causing me to jump back. The door actually trembled, which told me it was a mighty force. I gripped my rifle, heart pounding, and thought about stepping back or radioing for backup, but I remembered my orders to remain at my station and not to engage unless absolutely necessary. The banging subsided, but I could still hear that low growl or moan. Then quiet. Eventually, two men wearing those advanced hazmat suits emerged from a side entrance, opened the steel door, and slipped in. The door slid shut behind them. I never found out what was in that chamber or the nature of that banging, but it left me shaken enough that I even had trouble sleeping the next day after shift. Over time, I started to see the bigger pattern. We were not just storing or containing one singular anomaly. It was an entire menagerie of unknowns, apparently, or a rotating roster of them that came and went in those cargo trucks. Whether they were indigenous to Earth or not, or whether they were genetically created by our scientists as part of some black budget program, I still could not say for sure. But the combination of rumored reptilian creatures, unusual canine-like entities, possible telepathy, and advanced containment procedures, it all pointed to a large-scale operation. Possibly multiple agencies were involved: Army, intelligence groups, private contractors, maybe even foreign scientists under some hush-hush Cold War or post-Cold War arrangement. We, the guards, were on a need-to-know basis. Actually, scratch that. We were effectively on a no-need-to-know basis. Our job was to stand post and keep our mouths shut. I remember hearing that some local civilians occasionally tried to wander onto the proving ground by accident, especially hunters or hikers. They would be swiftly apprehended, warned about trespassing on federal property, and then escorted off. But once in a while, we would hear scuttlebutt about a civilian who stumbled across something they should not have. Those stories always ended the same. These individuals were quickly handed over to men in suits, never to be seen again, or at least never heard from publicly again. The local townspeople got the message that it was dangerous to poke around the edges of Dugway. Maybe that is why we rarely had any big public outcry or local activism in that region. People knew that crossing the fence line meant more trouble than they could handle. As my time at Dugway drew to a close, I tried to put it all behind me. I told myself that the Army does a lot of things in the name of national security that the average citizen cannot understand, and maybe the hollow compound was part of some plan to protect us from foreign threats. But that memory of the crate that seemed to move on its own, the recollection of hearing that wailing inside the tunnel, it never left. I left the Army in 1993, moved on with my life, tried to be a civilian. Over the next years, I always had this sense that I was being monitored. Maybe it is paranoia, but there were a few incidents where I swore the same black SUV followed me around for a while. It could have been coincidence, or it could have been them making sure I towed the line. I always kept my mouth shut publicly, never shared details, tried to follow the vow of secrecy, but in private, I could not hide from my own thoughts. When the new millennium rolled around, I started seeing more references on the internet to places like Area 51, Wright-Patterson, Montauk, and rumors about Dugway being the new Area 52. That is a phrase some people used. I would scan these websites, half laughing at the conspiracy theories, half acknowledging that they did not know how close they might be to the truth. Because if they had seen the things I had seen, they would not be laughing. They would be unsettled, to say the least. But still, I kept my silence because I feared retribution. As I got older, that fear lessened a bit, replaced by a desire to unburden myself of these secrets. My turning point came a couple of years ago, when I was diagnosed with a severe terminal condition. The doctors told me I might have a few years if I was lucky. It forced me to reckon with the reality that I did not want to carry these memories to my grave without at least sharing them somewhere. I prepared a written journal, hidden away in case something happens to me prematurely. I had considered mailing it anonymously to a journalist or uploading it online, but I always hesitated. Finally, I decided to write this account in a more free-flow format, hoping that someone out there listening might piece something together. As I said in the beginning, if it ends up on your YouTube channel or just sits in a private folder, I truly do not mind. Putting these words down is therapeutic and might serve a purpose if the truth ever needs to be revealed in full. Even after so many years, the official lines from the government about Dugway remain very mundane. They talk about chemical and biotesting, advanced drone testing, sure, but they never mention the deeper workspace, the caverns, the unexplainable cargo, or the unnatural creatures. It is also worth mentioning that the local tribal communities out there have their own traditions about shapeshifters and strange beings in the desert. I wonder if there is a connection. One time, I spoke indirectly to a local man who hinted that the Army has awakened something ancient or is working with powers that are older than we realize. He did not elaborate, and I did not push him, but that conversation stuck with me. Maybe the region has always been a focal point for weird occurrences, and the Army simply took advantage of that location. I also recall an incident in early 1990 when some geologists on site were doing seismic readings. I happened to escort them because they needed a guard presence while operating near restricted areas. They were dropping small charges to map the subterranean layers. Later, one of the geologists let slip that the structures beneath Dugway ran much deeper than any normal facility, and that there were unusual hollows or caverns that did not appear to be naturally formed. He was baffled, but I noticed his colleague giving him a look that said, "Shut up." We parted ways, and I imagine they had to submit their data to the Army. Who knows if that data saw the light of day? But it confirmed my suspicion that the hollow compound was possibly just one segment of a larger labyrinth beneath the desert floor. Another memory involves a secondhand story from a friend I made at the base gym. He told me that in the 1970s, a plane carrying unusual cargo crash landed somewhere west of the facility. When the Army arrived, they cordoned off the area. The friend had heard from a retired pilot that the cargo included remains or live subjects of some unknown origin. Whether that was rumor or fact, I could not say, But it all lines up with the sense of strangeness that clings to Dugway like a permanent fog. Upon reflection, I believe that numerous government arms, possibly in cooperation with major private contractors, use Dugway as a hub for exotic research, containment, and maybe even a form of negotiation or partnership with non-human entities. That is speculation on my part, born from all the hints, glimpses, and half-heard conversations over my 4 years working in the Hollow compound. But my gut tells me it is close to the mark. Why else maintain such a high level of secrecy, to the point of threatening careers and lives? Why else rotate so many guards in and out, never letting them get too comfortable or curious? Why else would nighttime convoys carry living cargo that moaned and cried out in unearthly tones? To this day, my biggest regret is that I never got the nerve to take photographic evidence or to keep detailed notes that I could smuggle out. At the time, I was too scared, too indoctrinated, too worried about my family, and too unsure of what I was even witnessing. Hindsight is 20/20. If I had known back then that I would be at this stage of my life, I might have risked it. But all I have now is my recollection of events. Some folks might say it is useless without hard proof, but I am telling it anyway. I know there are other men and women out there with similar experiences who have kept quiet all these years. Maybe they are old now too, or they have had nightmares they cannot quell. Perhaps they also considered telling their story. Maybe after hearing this, if it ever gets out, they will feel more inclined to speak up, but I am not really holding my breath. Details that stand out to me in the final months of my time there. The local talk about missing livestock increased. The strange lights in the sky were more frequent, and security around the Hollow compound was even tighter. One day, I spotted an entire caravan of black SUVs, easily a dozen or more, rolling into the facility. Men and women in formal attire, with briefcases and serious expressions. The rumor was that it was a high-level delegation from Washington, perhaps from the Department of Defense or other agencies. They spent hours underground, and then departed without a word. That same evening, some of the scientists who usually had a frantic energy about them seemed oddly subdued, as if something big had been decided. Maybe they had authorized further expansions of the program. Maybe they decided to shut some aspect down. I do not know. But the atmosphere was incredibly tense. One more event from 1992 that I recall vividly was a security sweep in the Hollow compound that required every guard to do a floor-by-floor check. They gave us a list of procedures that was extremely detailed, but it was not the standard procedure for a typical security inspection. We had to check every door, press a sensor on the wall near each door, log the reading, confirm there were no unauthorized items. Everyone was on edge, especially as we went deeper. There was a sense that if we opened the wrong door or looked too closely, we might see something we should not, and that is exactly how it felt. There was a door near a far corner of the corridor. It was rarely used, and normally it remained locked. That day, my partner and I realized the lock panel had a faint red glow, indicating it had been accessed recently. We did not see a single person in that sector. We radioed it in, and the answer we got was to ignore it, that it was a false reading. We had learned by then not to press further, but to me, it meant that someone or something was moving around in the less traveled parts of the Hollow compound, beyond the watchful eyes of the standard guard rotations. I spoke indirectly with a med tech who had done some time in a restricted ward of the small on-base clinic. He told me that occasionally, men in suits or in black uniforms would bring in an injured soldier or lab technician who had bizarre wounds, scratches, burns, or deep tissue damage that did not match any known weapons. Then the men in suits would stand guard in the examination room, instructing the med staff to treat the injuries, but not ask questions or log the incident in the standard records. They had a separate ledger where they wrote everything down, and the official hospital record would just say minor workplace injury or something equally vague. The medtech was unsettled by it, but did not dare defy them. As far as day-to-day life, the real tragedy is how we all carried on as if nothing was amiss. We would go to chow, talk about sports, play cards, all the normal soldier stuff. Meanwhile, this monstrous secret simmered beneath our feet. Occasionally, we would get glimpses that jolted us, but we always returned to the routine, because that is what soldiers do. It was the only way to remain sane, I suppose. A final personal memory that haunts me involves a random malfunction of the cargo elevator in the middle of the night. It must have been 1992. I was there with my partner, and we heard an alarm that the elevator was stuck between levels. Command told us to stand by. About 15 minutes later, a group of men from the deeper level arrived. They had a heavy crowbar and some specialized gear that looked more advanced than normal army equipment. They pried the elevator doors open, revealing the shaft. The elevator car was indeed stuck about a yard above the threshold. One of them peered in with a flashlight, then turned to the rest and said it looked empty. They started to pry the outer doors further, presumably to try to get the car moving. That is when we heard a loud clang from inside the shaft, followed by something like a hiss or a screech. Everyone jumped back. My partner gave me a wide-eyed look, but neither of us said a word, because the men in suits were obviously in charge. They told us to step back and not to interfere. They continued working and eventually got the power restored, closed the doors, and that was it. The next day, the elevator was functioning normally, as if nothing had happened. But the memory of that hiss or screech in the dark has never left me. It was so out of place, so inhuman. In conclusion, though I do not even know if I should use that word, because this is more a confession than a neat wrapped-up story, I saw things at Dugway Proving Ground that defy conventional explanation. The subterranean facility we called the Hollow Compound was a place where I believe our government, along with shadowy private or foreign interests, stored or studied entities, technologies, or organisms beyond what the public is allowed to know. I witnessed everything from unmarked convoys transporting living cargo, to men in advanced hazmat suits responding to mysterious breaches, to fleeting glimpses on security cameras of tall, non-human figures. Numerous colleagues vanished or were quietly discharged, and I was repeatedly warned to keep silent if I valued my future. I am speaking now because I do not have much future left, and I cannot bear to stay silent any longer. You might wonder if I ever had direct contact with any of these creatures or phenomena. Truth be told, I never physically touched anything or got a clear, unobstructed close-up look. Everything was either partially obscured by distance, lighting, protective gear, or secrecy. But the cumulative effect of all those partial glimpses and overheard conversations paints a clear picture in my mind. We were guarding something far beyond normal. We were not told the truth, only to follow orders, and that is exactly what we did. For 4 years, it weighed on me, and it has continued to weigh on me ever since. There is a reason so many folks call Dugway the new Area 52. Maybe that is a catchy phrase, or maybe it is an understatement. If there are any official records that corroborate what I have said, they are locked away in classification vaults. They might never see the light of day. But this is my personal testimony. I swear on what little time I have left that I have related as accurately as my memory allows. The cargo trucks, the men in mysterious uniforms, the weird growls, that unstoppable feeling of dread whenever we had to descend deeper into the hollow compound. It was real, and it still sends chills up my spine to recall it. That is all I have to share for now. The rest is just me attempting to live out the final stretch of my life with an ounce of honesty, having unburdened myself of these secrets that have haunted me for decades.